For the next part, to make the game look actually good, I want to talk about particles. And particles are basically small objects that are dynamically generated. The best example for that would be we're going to create some smoke in this part. And for that smoke, we're going to create lots of small dots and then combine them, and to the player this will look like smoke. Also, we're going to add some visuals for the laser, or more specifically, when the laser is shot. I think explaining all of this in practice is going to be much easier. So let's jump straight into Godot. Here we are back in the editor, and I want to create a new scene. And this new scene, as a base node, is going to get a static body 2D. Let's rename this one to Steam Vent. And then this I can save right away. Under Scenes, there we have Objects, and there I want to have the Steam Vent. Cool. Now, this one is going to get a sprite. And the sprite we can get under Graphics, and in there we have Objects, and under Objects we have all the way at the bottom a ventilation hole. So this I want to drag in there. And this is going to give us simply a ventilation hole. Now, before we start with the actual particles, I want to give this a collision shape. And the shape here should be fairly straightforward. This needs to have a collision shape. The shape should be a circle shape. And let's align it more or less accurately. This is looking good. Cool. Also, I want to move the collision shape behind the sprite so we can see a bit better what's going on. Right now, this kind of object is going to look incredibly boring inside of the game. And to make it more interesting, I want to generate smoke that moves something like this. So we have smoke coming out of this and moving in a certain direction. And to create something like smoke, we will need a particle emitter. And like everything else in Godot, this is going to be another node. So with the Steam Vent selected, I click on Controller Command A, and now I type in particle. We have CPU particles and GPU particles, at least in a 2D space. Inside of the 3D space, all of that gets a lot more complex. But in our case, we only have 2 nodes. And if you look at the description, we get a CPU-based particle emitter or a GPU-based particle emitter. Now, you might be wondering, what's the difference between these two? And well, if you're creating lots of particles, you want them to run on the GPU, because the GPU is much more powerful and much better at processing these kinds of particles. Unfortunately, you don't always have a graphics card available. For example, when you make a mobile game or a browser game, you might have to work with less powerful hardware. And for that, you would use CPU particles. But in our case, we are making a game for a computer, so I want to use GPU particles. Basically, the way you want to think about it is that CPU particles is for weaker systems, GPU particles is for everything else. So let's work with GPU particles 2D. I can click on Create and nothing happened. To make something happen, we have to look on the right in the inspector. The most important attribute in there is the process material. Right now, this one is empty. We can give it a shader material or a particle process material. The second one is what we want to go for. And now we can actually see something. We have a couple of particles going in one direction, which arguably isn't particularly helpful, but we can customize all of that quite a bit. If you click on Particle Process Material, there we get a whole bunch of options. For example, what we could be doing is set the emission shape. Right now, it's a point. This means all particles are emitted from this one point. But in my case, I want to have a sphere, and this sphere should have a certain size, depending on how large you want this area to be. So I think a bit smaller than this should be okay. And yeah, this one is looking better. If you want the particles to stop falling, you would want to look at gravity. We have 0, 98, and 0. If I set all of this to 0, 0, and 0, we get no movement at all. And in my case, I want the particles to move to the top right, so this direction. For that, I want to have x being positive, let's say, I don't know, 50. And then I want them to go up, and this would be negative, I don't know, let's say 45, just to have some random numbers. With that, we already get some nicer behavior. So this doesn't look terrible. Well, it still looks terrible, but it looks less terrible than before. One way to make all of this look much nicer is to look at this scale. because in there we have scale minimum and scale maximum. And Godot is going to pick a random number in between. Right now they're both 1, so we always have a scale of 1. But if I make that much larger, we're getting a better behavior. So this is definitely coming together. If I now go back to the level and with the ground node selected, add this scene, I want to add the Steam vent. And this I want to have, let me move it around. Let's put it somewhere there for now. If I now run the game again, we have a Steam vent. Although this doesn't look amazing right now, but I guess you can at the very least tell what's going on somewhat. The major issue we have right now is that we always have a square. So this isn't great. And this we cannot change inside of the process material. So this I want to minimize for now. Instead, what we need is a texture. And the texture is going to be an image. So under, I think I put it under decals, there we have white.png. This is the graphic I want to use. And to use it, I simply have to drag it into the texture. And now we are getting some very strange behavior. The reason why this is happening is because the graphic is way too large. Or more specifically, inside of the process material under scale, we have a way too large maximum scale. Let's set this to a 3, and this is going to feel much better. And this is looking much more like actual Steam. So let's try this again. And well, we are making progress. Still not amazing, but certainly better. I suppose the most important thing for now is we don't have that many dots. And for that, at the amount all the way at the top, I want to set this to, let's go with 20. And this is feeling a little bit better. Another thing that you could be doing, if you look at color, there we have color and color ramp. For example, you could change the opacity a bit and then make all of this a touch darker. And I think we do need a lot more dots. So instead of 20, let's go with 60. And possibly even higher, maybe 100. That probably feels a good bit better. What I can also do is lower the opacity and then just see what feels good. When it comes to particle systems, you do want to play around a lot, and there's a lot of stuff you can do. So all of these options, you can just play with them and see what you like. What you see quite often is a ramp. So in this case, the color ramp. What this one is doing right now, it's empty. If I give it a new gradient texture 1D, then we get some weird behavior. And what this one is doing is when a particle is spawned, it starts with black, and then over time it becomes white. We could change this. So if I click on it and double click on that, we get another color. And let's say I want a particle to start white with full transparency. And then towards the end, so I click on the ending bit, I want transparency to go basically away entirely and have this thing go into a darker color. And there you can see we have a new gradient, and this one is giving us a different kind of behavior. And that should be a decently okayish behavior for inside of the game. So once again, for this kind of thing, you do want to play around a lot to get the kind of look that you want. You could also change the scale and give this one a curve. But in my case, I think the color was a bit too strong. So let me give this a bit more opacity, especially towards the end. This might have been a bit too low. And then the color could be a bit brighter. And then I also want to have, for the gravity, slightly faster movement. So instead of 50, I want 100. Instead of negative 45, I want to have negative 150. On top of that, the emission shape could be a bit larger. So this feels better. And then for the amount of particles, let's go with 200. And there we go. This is coming together much better. So with that, we have some steam. And what you really want to be aware of, that you are spawning a huge amount of particles. And for that, if you have a proper GPU, this isn't going to be too taxing, especially in a 2D environment. but still you do want to be conscious of the performance. So use this sparingly. One good way to do that is to only have a certain amount of particles. 200 is still fine, but in your own game, test this a lot. Changing the amount of particles can make a huge difference. I suppose I should also mention we have time, collision, drawing, and trails. Time is the one I want to focus on for now, and there, for example, we have a lifetime. If we extend that, we get much longer living particles. Although in my case, I'm not really interested in that, and this is still way too long. Let's set this to 1.5 to some kind of custom value. And what is much more important, you can also set one shot. This is something we are going to explore in just a bit. But if I set this one to on, then we get lots of particles and then they disappear because we are only spawning every particle just once. And you can see at the top, emitting is off. If I set this to on again, we get all of the particles, but just once, and there we go. We can do this multiple times, and we only always have one round of particles. Now for this one, I don't want to enable it. So I just want to have emitting enabled and one shot set to false. Now besides that, you could also look at drawing or collision, but all of this is a bit more advanced, so I'm going to ignore it. Instead, what I want you guys to do is when the player is shooting a laser. Inside of the player, I want you guys to spawn some particles along with the laser. And to be a bit more precise, for the exercise, I want you guys to emit particles when the player is shooting a laser. You can reuse the same texture, but make sure that you are changing lots of other attributes, like the color or the scaling or the duration. Just see what looks good. Finally, a really important part is that one shot needs to be enabled. We only want to spawn a couple of particles when the player has shot a laser, but they should not be continuous. So with that, pause the video and try to implement your own particle system. With the player selected, I want to add another node, which is going to be GPU particles 2D. This one right now is giving us a warning that we don't have a material. For that, I want to have a process material, which is going to be a particle process material. If I have that selected, we get particles that are barely visible. And right away, we have to make one change. And that is that these particles should be at the nozzle of the gun, basically here. Next up, the direction doesn't work at all. So this one we also have to update. That we can do quite easily. Inside of the process material, I want to update the direction. Although to be a bit more specific, we have direction and we have the gravity. The gravity by default should be 0, 0, and 0. So the particles don't move at all. However, then we have a direction, which right now by default is 1, 0, and 0. So we should only have movement in the x-axis. But this we can't see at all right now. Everything just is static, so we have a white dot there. To change that, we want to give each particle an initial velocity. And this we can do on the right. There we have initial velocity. And let's give it some randomness, so something like this. And that is looking significantly better. For these numbers inside of direction, you can update the spread. In my case, I went with 15. This is a much more narrow range, but once again, just choose whatever you think is looking good. Besides that, if I minimize these two tabs, the next important part is we will need a texture. And I still have white.png, and this I want to drag in there. And with that, we get something much more visible. So this is a good start. And let's try the scene itself. And let's hope this is still working. And yeah, it's kind of working, especially if you move around. This doesn't work perfectly yet, but at the very least we get something. The main thing I'm looking for is that all of this aligns with the player direction. So if the player moves or looks at the top right, the particles move in this direction as well. Which they do, so this is a good start. The one important thing that might be a bit of a challenge is that we only want to spawn these particles when the player is shooting a laser. And for that, under time, I want to set one shot and enable it and set it to true. And now inside of the code, so the player code, and this I do want to extend. Whenever we have an input action for the primary action, this if statement, I want to emit the particles, which I can do quite easily. I want to get my particles node, so GPU particles 2D, and this has an attribute called emitting, which I want to set to true. And that is actually all we needed. So if I now run the game again, I can shoot a laser, and there we get a couple of particles. I can do this multiple times, and we get a couple of particles. So this is working, but the particles look terrible. So this isn't great yet. Also, if I shoot multiple lasers, this is really inconsistent. So we have to update some things, which means with the GPU particles selected, we have to update a lot of these attributes to make all of this look good. What I started with was the initial velocity. Right now, this is quite low. I have set these numbers to 750 and 1000. If I run all of this again, we get particles that move really, really far because, well, we have a really high initial velocity. To account for this increased speed, I want to set the lifetime of each particle to a much lower number, let's say 0.2. And now if I run this again, each particle moves very, very quickly. So this is definitely an improvement. Although all of the particles are still much too large. For that, and the scale, I want to have a scale minimum of 0.05 and a scale maximum of 0.1. If I run that again, now we get particles that are way too small. So these numbers are probably a bit overly aggressive. Let's say 0.5 and 1. And that's feeling a bit better. I guess 0.3 and 0.8 should work. And this is just a thing you have to practice over and over. Eventually, you find some numbers that you like. Next up though, much more importantly, I want to work on the color. This is the part that really doesn't work right now. Instead of a white color, I want to have some light bluish because that's the color of the laser as well. Also, the transparency should not be full. I want to have some fairly see-through kind of color. So if I run this again, that is starting to come together much more nicely. Also, we can give this a color ramp, which is a gradient texture 1D. And for this one, we can set a color. The starting color is the color I have just set. And in there, we have a hexadecimal color. This we can simply copy with Control or Command S and then paste it in there. Now we get this starting color. And for the end color, I want to have the same color, except I want to make this more whitish and less transparent. At the end, you should have some kind of gradient that looks something like this. We start with a bluish tint and then we become more and more transparent. If I run that one again, we get something that's barely visible. So we want this to be more. So we want to increase these numbers a bit. And once again, this is just something you have to play around with. We get some very faint particle effects. Although I think the initial velocity could even be higher. Let's go with 1200 to 1500. And there's certainly something that works. And I don't want to keep you here for too long. You can play around with all of this to a great extent. And if you want your game to look good, then obviously you have to spend a lot of time with all of this. In my case though, this is a tutorial, so let's say for this part we are basically done.